There's a moment in history when the fate of entire cities hung not on the edge of a sword, but on the careful, calculated words of a single person. Picture this: towering castle walls, an army camped outside, supplies running low, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, could find a way to end the bloodshed without another life lost. This was the world of siege negotiation, an art so subtle, so powerful, that it could unravel years of conflict with nothing more than a well-timed conversation. These medieval diplomats weren't just messengers, they were master strategists, psychologists, and sometimes even illusionists, weaving words like spells to bend the will of kings and commanders. And yet, their stories have faded into the shadows, overshadowed by the clash of steel and the roar of battle. But today, we're bringing them back into the light. Think about the last time you tried to talk your way out of a difficult situation, maybe convincing a friend, negotiating a deal, or even diffusing tension in a heated moment. Now, imagine doing that with the stakes at their absolute highest, thousands of lives, the survival of a city, the balance of power in an entire region resting on your ability to choose the right words at the right time. That's what these negotiators faced every time they stepped into the no-man's land between two warring sides. They didn't just rely on charm or luck. They had a toolkit of psychological tactics, cultural insights, and even theatrical flair to sway their opponents. Some played on pride, others on fear, and a few used sheer audacity to pull off what seemed impossible. What's even more fascinating is how much of their craft still echoes in the diplomacy of today. The principles they pioneered, building trust, finding common ground, knowing when to push and when to retreat, are the same strategies used in boardrooms and international summits centuries later. But here's the twist: while we study their modern counterparts, the medieval negotiators who laid the groundwork have been all but forgotten, until now. Over the next while, we'll unravel their secrets, from the high-stakes bluffs that saved cities to the heartbreaking failures that changed the course of history. This isn't just a tale of the past, it's a masterclass in human persuasion, and you're about to see how these forgotten tacticians rewrote the rules of power without ever drawing a blade. So let's step into their world where every word was a weapon, and the greatest victories were won without a single drop of blood. The art of siege negotiation wasn't born in a single dramatic moment. It grew slowly, shaped by the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Imagine a time when kings and commanders faced a grim choice: starve a city into surrender over months, losing countless soldiers to disease and hunger, or find a way to talk their way to victory. It was this relentless calculus of cost that gave rise to the first true negotiators. In the Byzantine Empire, where diplomacy was as prized as military might, envoys were often scholars fluent in multiple languages, trained to read the subtle shifts in a ruler's tone or the unspoken fears behind their demands. Across the Islamic caliphates, imams and judges stepped into the role, their moral authority lending weight to their words. These weren't just messengers, they were human calculators, weighing pride against pragmatism, honor against survival. One of the earliest recorded examples comes from the Siege of Antioch in the late 11th century, where a weary city on the brink of collapse sent a bishop to parley with the attacking forces. With no army left to defend its walls, the bishop didn't rely on threats or bluster. Instead, he appealed to the attacker's faith, weaving scripture into his plea for mercy. It worked. The siege ended without further bloodshed, a testament to the power of persuasion over force. But not all early negotiations were so noble. Some envoys played on superstition, spreading rumors of omens or divine displeasure to shake an opponent's resolve. Others exploited rivalries within the enemy camp, whispering promises to factions willing to betray their own leaders. What made these early negotiators so effective wasn't just their eloquence, it was their deep understanding of human nature. They knew when to flatter a warlord's ego, when to stoke his fears, and when to dangle the one concession he couldn't refuse. A clever envoy might offer a face-saving retreat to a proud commander, allowing him to claim honor while secretly avoiding disaster. Another might negotiate the safe passage of women and children, knowing it would sap the defender's will to fight. These tactics became the building blocks of a craft that would later save kingdoms. And while the tools of war evolved, catapults giving way to cannons, swords to muskets, the essence of siege negotiation remained unchanged. The right words spoken at the right time could be more devastating than any siege engine. To truly grasp the brilliance of these medieval diplomats, you have to understand the sheer unpredictability of their role. Unlike today's career ambassadors with formal training and state backing, these negotiators were often plucked from obscurity, monks with a gift for languages, merchants who'd traded behind enemy lines, even captured knights who'd earned their captors' respect. Their authority didn't come from titles or treaties. It came from their ability to think on their feet in a world where one wrong word could mean exile or execution. Imagine walking into a war tent where the ruler across from you still had blood on his gloves from the morning skirmish. That was their workplace. What set these negotiators apart wasn't just their fluency in multiple tongues, though that was crucial, but their mastery of what we'd now call cultural code switching. A diplomat negotiating with the Ottoman court might quote Persian poetry to flatter a sultan's intellect, then pivot to brutal realism when dealing with a mercenary captain holding a city ransom. They were chameleons, adapting their mannerisms, dress, even their humor to fit the room. Records from the Kingdom of Aragon describe one envoy who deliberately arrived in worn-out travel clothes to a meeting with a prideful duke, knowing the display of hardship would trigger the nobleman's sense of chivalry. It worked. The Duke lowered his demands before talks even began. But their greatest weapon, emotional intelligence, centuries ahead of its time. Where modern negotiators rely on data and precedent, these envoys operated like human lie detectors, studying micro-expressions, pauses in speech, even the way a ruler clenched a goblet during tense moments. The chronicles of the 100 Years' War tell of an English priest envoy who diffused a French king's rage by mirroring his body language, then slowly shifting to calmer postures, a primitive form of neuro-linguistic programming. Others exploited psychological triggers. One Venetian agent famously, accidentally, dropped a letter during negotiations with Milan, knowing the Duke's spies would intercept it. The fabricated message hinted at non-existent allies ready to betray him, panicking the Duke into concessions. Yet for all their cunning, these diplomats walked a razor's edge. Success might earn a chest of gold. Failure often meant being thrown from the walls as a message. Some turned this peril into theater, like the Byzantine envoy who collapsed from exhaustion mid-negotiation, buying critical days for his city's defenses to strengthen. Others weaponized reputation. The legendary negotiator Ibn Khaldun once halted a siege simply by arriving, as commanders feared his silver tongue more than any army. Their legacy isn't just in the sieges they ended, but in proving that even in the darkest ages, the right words could be sharper than any sword. The art of delay wasn't just about stalling. It was a high-stakes performance where every pause, every request for clarification, even the deliberate misplacement of a document could buy precious days for a city on the brink. Picture a negotiator kneeling before a besieging king, his face the picture of earnest cooperation as he slowly, methodically debates the wording of a surrender treaty, all while behind the walls, carpenters reinforce gates and farmers sneak grain through hidden tunnels. The best practitioners of this tactic understood something profound. In siege warfare, time was a currency more valuable than gold. Take the infamous standoff at the Burgundian Siege of Neuss in 1474. The town's defenders, hopelessly outnumbered, sent their chancellor, a man named Heinrich, to negotiate with Charles the Bold. Heinrich didn't just ask for time to consider terms, he orchestrated an elaborate charade. He insisted on consulting every guild, every church elder, even the town's astrologer, citing ancient customs that required consensus. Meanwhile, couriers disguised as friars slipped past enemy lines, carrying pleas for help to neighboring rulers. By the time Charles realized he'd been played, reinforcements were already marching to break the siege. But delaying tactics required more than creativity. They demanded an almost theatrical sense of psychology. A clumsy delay might anger a commander into attacking, while a masterful one could make him believe he was still in control. Some negotiators exploited cultural norms, like the Mongol tradition of granting multiple days for deliberation. Others used the weather as an ally, pretending storms or flooded roads prevented messengers from returning with answers. The most brilliant ploys involved reverse psychology. One Byzantine envoy famously, accidentally, let slip false rumors that his city had months of supplies left, prompting the besiegers to settle into a long wait, just as the real food stores dwindled to weeks. What made these maneuvers so effective was their dual nature. While buying physical time for defenses, they also eroded the besiegers' morale. An army camped outside walls grew restless as days turned to weeks. Diseases spread, alliances frayed, and the cost of maintaining the siege mounted. A negotiator's ability to stretch those tensions without snapping them was akin to a tightrope walk over a chasm, and when done right, the rewards were staggering. The Siege of Lisbon in 1147 collapsed entirely because Muslim defenders prolonged talks until the Christian Crusaders' fleet, running low on supplies, had to withdraw. No swords drawn, no walls breached, just the quiet, relentless power of patience wielded like a blade. Psychological warfare wasn't just about spreading fear, it was an intricate dance of perception, where the illusion of strength often mattered more than the reality. Medieval negotiators understood something profound. The human mind surrenders long before the walls do. Imagine a diplomat standing before the gates of a besieged city, not with threats of violence, but with a carefully crafted story about an approaching relief force, one that didn't actually exist. The sheer suggestion of hopelessness could unravel months of resistance in a single conversation. Some of the most effective psychological plays relied on exploiting superstition. During the siege of Château-Gaillard in the early 13th century, French negotiators circulated rumors that a local saint had appeared in visions, foretelling the fall of the English-held fortress. They didn't need to prove it. The mere whisper of divine abandonment seeped into the defenders' minds like poison. Other envoys staged elaborate spectacles like the infamous, miraculous snowfall during a summer siege in Spain, arranged by quick-thinking defenders who scattered white feathers from the walls to simulate an omen. The besiegers, convinced God favored their enemies, retreated before the ruse was uncovered. But the real masters of this craft didn't just manipulate beliefs, they weaponized misinformation with surgical precision. A chronicle from the Crusades describes a Muslim negotiator who accidentally let a Christian spy overhear plans for a non-existent traitor within the enemy ranks. Paranoia spread like wildfire, turning allies against each other. Similarly, Venetian diplomats were known to send fake letters, written in code and deliberately left to be intercepted, filled with false troop movements or alliances. The goal was never to deceive forever, just long enough to fracture morale at the critical moment. What made these tactics so devastating was their asymmetry. A single envoy with nothing but wit could undo an army's advantage. Take the Siege of Orleans, where Joan of Arc's mere presence, her unshakable conviction, reversed the psychological tide overnight. The English, who had laughed at the idea of a peasant girl leading armies, found their certainty crumbling as her legend grew. That's the essence of medieval psychological warfare. It wasn't about the weapons you had, but the stories you made others believe. And in the hands of a skilled negotiator, those stories could bend reality itself. A clever negotiator knew that even the sturdiest walls had one weakness: the people behind them. When brute force failed and psychological games fell short, the most effective tactic was often the simplest, appealing to raw self-interest. Picture a seasoned diplomat standing before a city's war council, not with threats, but with a carefully itemized list of rewards: land grants for the nobility, amnesty for the soldiers, trade concessions for the merchants. Where fear might harden resolve, the glitter of gold could soften it in an instant. History brims with examples of incentives unraveling sieges that seemed unbreakable. During the Reconquista, Christian negotiators routinely offered Muslim defenders generous terms, keeping their homes, worship rights, even local governance if they surrendered peacefully. The alternative, a sacked city with nothing left to lose. These weren't empty promises. Savvy envoys knew credibility was key. When Alfonso VI took Toledo in the 11th century, he honored every concession, knowing future cities would rather negotiate than fight to the death. But the real artistry lay in tailoring incentives to hidden ambitions. A garrison commander might resist outright bribes, but what if the offer included a royal title or marriage into nobility? The chronicles of the 100 Years' War tell of a French captain who held a key fortress until English negotiators dangled governorship of a richer province. He opened the gates by dawn. Merchants proved especially vulnerable to economic carrots: tax exemptions, monopoly rights, or first access to conquered markets could turn the wealthiest citizens into de facto allies. The darkest iterations of this tactic targeted human frailty. Some defenders found their resolve crumbling not from greed but exhaustion. Negotiators would extend offers of warm beds, hot meals, and safe passage to families, basic comforts that became irresistible after months under siege. During the brutal campaign for Malta in 1565, Ottoman diplomats nearly succeeded by promising defenders ships home rather than chains, playing on their homesickness. Yet incentives carried risks. Overplay your hand, and you might embolden the enemy to demand more. Underestimate their pride, and offers could backfire spectacularly, like when the Duke of Burgundy's lavish terms to a rebellious town only stiffened their defiance, as if surrender now meant admitting their lives had a price. The masters of this game understood incentives weren't just about what was offered, but how. Present them too early and you seemed desperate, too late and desperation became yours. The perfect moment, when the first cracks appeared in morale, when hunger gnawed at discipline, when the defenders began eyeing each other with suspicion. That's when a well-timed promise could turn a stalemate into surrender, not through force, but through the oldest human weakness of all, the irresistible lure of a better deal. The most fragile part of any besieged city wasn't its walls, it was the delicate web of alliances holding its people together. A shrewd negotiator could unravel that web with nothing more than a whisper in the right ear. While armies clashed outside, these diplomats waged a quieter war inside, turning neighbor against neighbor and ambition against loyalty. The key lay in understanding that no city was truly united. Behind every gate stood factions with competing desires, merchants craving open trade routes, nobles jealous of rivals, soldiers weary of unpaid wages, peasants pushed to the brink by hunger. The moment a negotiator found that fracture line, the real siege began. Take the fall of Constantinople in 1453. While Ottoman cannons battered the walls, Mehmed II's envoys were busy exploiting centuries-old tensions between the city's Italian and Greek populations. They promised Geno's merchants special trading privileges if they stood aside, and suddenly, whole sections of the defense found their supply lines mysteriously delayed. Similar divisions doomed the French at Rouen in 1419, where English negotiators secretly promised the city's guilds lower taxes under their rule. By the time the French commander realized his own citizens were sabotaging the defense, it was too late. But the true masters of this tactic didn't just exploit existing rifts, they manufactured new ones. During the Siege of Granada, Castilian diplomats spread rumors that the Muslim ruler planned to abandon his people and flee to North Africa. The lie, repeated in market squares and mosques, eroded trust so thoroughly that defenders began deserting their posts. Other negotiators staged elaborate charades. One Burgundian envoy pretended to be overheard gossiping about a noble family's plot to overthrow their own king, knowing servants would carry the tale straight to the palace. Within days, paranoia ripped through the leadership like wildfire. The risk, of course, was backlash. A clumsy attempt to bribe the wrong official could harden resistance, as the Mongols learned at the Siege of Kiev, when their gold offer to a Slavic prince was publicly thrown from the walls, uniting the city in defiance. The smartest negotiators played a subtler game. They'd identify the most respected figure in a faction, a guild master, a popular priest, and shower them with small, deniable favors, extra rations for their followers, a private guarantee of safety. By the time the larger bribe was proposed, the groundwork of trust was already laid. What made this tactic so devastating was its invisibility. Unlike battering rams or starvation, the erosion of unity left no visible scars until the moment the gates swung open from within. And in that final hour, when the negotiator walked through those gates to accept surrender, the real victory wasn't over the enemy, it was over the very idea that solidarity could outlast human nature. The greatest sieges weren't won by breaking walls, but by proving no wall was ever strong enough to contain the fractures inside. There was a line every medieval negotiator knew not to cross until the moment they absolutely had to. When offers of gold or appeals to reason fell on deaf ears, the final card left to play was the unvarnished truth of what awaited a city that refused to bend. This wasn't the calculated menace of modern diplomacy. It was a visceral, graphic depiction of the abyss. Skilled envoys didn't just threaten destruction, they painted it in strokes so vivid that defenders could smell the smoke, hear the screams, feel the weight of chains before they were ever forged. What made these warnings so potent wasn't just their brutality, but their chilling specificity. Consider the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, where Crusader negotiators didn't merely promise defeat, they described the exact streets where blood would flow ankle-deep, the churches that would burn with refugees inside, the children who'd be sold in markets from Aleppo to Cairo. They knew vague threats bred defiance, but precision bred paralysis. The same tactic shattered resistance at Magdeburg in 1631, when imperial envoys distributed pamphlets detailing the fate of nearby villages, down to the names of families slaughtered and the prices their belongings fetched at auction. Defenders didn't just fear death, they feared becoming entries in someone's ledger. Yet the masters of this grim craft understood a crucial nuance: timing. Deliver the threat too early, and you risked uniting the enemy in desperate resolve. Wait too long, and starvation might already have hardened their hearts past fear. The perfect moment came when hope and hunger were balanced on a knife's edge, when defenders had just enough strength to imagine survival, but not enough to ignore its cost. At the Siege of Acre in 1291, Mamluk diplomats timed their ultimatum to coincide with the first outbreaks of disease inside the walls, whispering of mass graves dug beyond the hills, ready for the sick and healthy alike. Within a week, the gates opened, but the darkest genius lay in making threats credible without sounding eager to carry them out. A negotiator who relished violence might push defenders into last stands, while one who seemed pained by necessity could spark second thoughts. The annals of the Teutonic Knights record an envoy who wept while describing the sacking of Riga, not out of compassion, but because tears made his warnings feel inevitable rather than vindictive. Others leveraged reputation. When Tamerlane's diplomats arrived at a rebellious city, they didn't need to invent horrors. They simply recited the fates of Delhi or Damascus, letting memory do the work. What's chilling is how often these tactics worked without a single blow being struck. The Siege of Barcelona in 1476 collapsed after Aragonese envoys circulated eyewitness accounts of Italian cities reduced to rubble, complete with sketches of severed heads mounted on pikes. The defenders' resolve crumbled not because they lacked courage, but because the negotiators made despair feel like arithmetic rather than cowardice. In the end, that was the true power of annihilation threats. They didn't just frighten people, they convinced them that surrender wasn't defeat, but the last rational choice left. In a world where heaven and earth felt dangerously close, the threat of divine wrath could shake even the most hardened warlord's resolve. Medieval negotiators didn't just wield scripture like a weapon, they crafted entire theological arguments tailored to their opponent's deepest fears. Picture a Cistercian monk standing before the gates of a rebellious city, not with an army at his back, but with a relic clutched in his hands, warning that continued resistance would curse the land for generations. This wasn't mere theater, it was psychological warfare dressed in vestments. The effectiveness of religious appeals hinged on an intimate knowledge of local beliefs. A negotiator facing Muslim defenders might quote the Quran's verses on mercy, while one treating with Christian lords would invoke the parable of the Good Samaritan. During the Albigensian Crusade, papal legates turned the tide by framing surrender as an act of penance, offering besieged Cathars not just survival but salvation. The brilliance lay in making compromise feel like divine will. When the Sultan Saladin offered generous terms to Crusader cities, his envoys emphasized how Islam honored people of the book, transforming political pragmatism into spiritual duty. Clergy brought unique advantages to the negotiating table. Their robes granted them perceived neutrality, even when they were anything but impartial. Bishops could float trial balloons for peace, claiming they spoke as shepherds, not soldiers, only to pivot into hardline demands if the enemy showed weakness. Some even staged miracles mid-negotiation. At the Siege of Toulouse, a priest accidentally spilled communion wine that stained the treaty parchment red, a sign defenders took as God's warning against breaking terms. But the darkest power of religious appeals was their ability to reframe humiliation as virtue. When Mongol envoys demanded Kiev's submission in 1240, they didn't just threaten annihilation, they promised the city's churches would be spared if surrender came before Lent. The implication was brutal: resist and your defiance would doom not just lives but souls. It worked. Kiev's leaders walked out barefoot, carrying icons, turning military defeat into a spectacle of piety. That was the negotiator's true art, making surrender feel less like failure and more like the first step toward redemption. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, honor wasn't just a virtue, it was the currency of survival. A knight's reputation could mean the difference between a seat at the high table and exile in disgrace. Savvy negotiators understood this better than anyone, and they wielded honor not as a shield, but as a key to unlock even the most stubborn gates. Their genius lay in transforming surrender from a mark of shame into a performance of nobility, crafting terms so flattering that defeat sounded like chivalry. Take the Siege of Calais in 1347, where Edward III of England faced a French garrison that would rather starve than submit. His negotiators didn't demand groveling, they proposed a spectacle. The defenders could march out with swords sheathed, banners flying, as if departing by mutual accord rather than conquest. The catch: 6 burghers would symbolically offer their lives in exchange for the town's safety, a grim theater that let the French commander claim he'd sacrificed himself for his people. Edward, knowing the value of magnanimity, spared them all. The message was clear: surrender could burnish a legacy, not break it. This tactic worked because it spoke directly to the medieval mind. A nobleman raised on tales of Roland and Arthur might balk at pragmatic surrender, but he'd leap at terms allowing him to honorably yield after showing valiant resistance. Negotiators became linguistic alchemists, turning the leaden shame of defeat into the gold of dignified compromise. During the Wars of the Roses, besieged lords were often offered parole, a promise to refrain from further fighting in exchange for freedom. It wasn't just mercy, it was a way to let warriors save face while quietly removing them from the conflict. The most cunning envoys tailored these honor plays to their audience. For Italian condottieri, who fought as much for contracts as glory, negotiators emphasized the professional courtesy of sparing a worthy opponent. In Iberia, where Christian and Muslim knights shared a code of respect, surrendering commanders might be gifted a fine horse or sword, tangible proof that their valor was acknowledged. Even the Mongols, infamous for their brutality, mastered this game. When Genghis Khan's envoys promised honorable incorporation into his empire, they weren't just offering survival. They were offering a place in history as partners rather than victims. But the illusion of honor had a razor's edge. Push too hard, and the target might see through the flattery. The failed Siege of Rhodes in 1480 shows the peril. Ottoman diplomats offered the knights hospitaller lavish terms, including safe passage with all relics, only to have the defenders spit on the parchment, accusing them of mocking their sacred vows. The finest negotiators walked this tightrope by grounding their offers in truth. When the Black Prince accepted the surrender of Limoges in 1370, he famously let the French garrison keep their weapons, knowing the gesture would echo across Europe as proof of his knightly mercy, while quietly exiling the defenders far from the next battlefield. What made this tactic so enduring was its dual victory. The conqueror gained a bloodless conquest, while the conquered preserved the myth of their unbroken spirit. In an age where perception shaped reality, that was the negotiator's greatest magic trick, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a sword, but the right story told at the right time. Some of history's most pivotal sieges didn't end with dramatic public surrenders. They were decided in candlelit backrooms, where whispered promises carried more weight than any treaty. Secret negotiations were the chess moves of siege diplomacy, hidden from the watching world but decisive in their impact. Imagine a besieged city where the official stance was defiant resistance, while behind the scenes, a mayor or garrison commander was already mapping out terms with the enemy. These covert talks thrived on discretion, often disguised as humanitarian pauses to exchange prisoners or discuss the treatment of civilians, but the real bargaining. That happened when the scribes and witnesses were safely out of earshot. The genius of backchannel deals lay in their flexibility. Public negotiations forced leaders into rigid postures, sworn oaths, grand declarations that made compromise look like weakness. But in secret, a defender could admit dwindling supplies, or an attacker might concede that prolonged siege costs were bleeding their treasury dry. Take the fall of Montségur in 1244, where Cathar leaders held public masses to show defiance, even as their envoys quietly arranged safe passage for non-combatants through hidden mountain paths. The besieging French cardinal knew the fortress would fall eventually, but secret talks spared him months of costly fighting and gave the defenders a face-saving exit. For negotiators, these shadow games required a spy's instincts. They identified which defenders had the most to lose or gain from surrender, then exploited those pressures without leaving fingerprints. A chronicle from the Siege of Harlech describes a Welsh prince's envoy posing as a wine merchant to slip proposals to the English constable's mistress, knowing she'd whisper them in the right ear. Others used coded language. During the 30 Years' War, Protestant and Catholic commanders exchanged hunting invitations that really meant ceasefire talks, with a kill count in their letters referring to troop numbers. But secrecy was a double-edged sword. Get caught, and you risked inflaming the very factions you hoped to placate. When Venetian agents were discovered offering bribes to Milanese officers during the War of the League of Cambrai, the scandal united a divided city against them. The best operators covered their tracks with elaborate ruses, like the Ottoman envoy who pretended to be a doctor treating dysentery in the enemy camp, using diagnoses to gauge morale. The cure for rebellion, he later wrote, is often found not in the surgeon's knife but in the purse. What made these covert deals so enduring wasn't just their effectiveness, but their necessity. In an era where honor culture demanded public intransigence, backchannels became the pressure valves that prevented sieges from ending in annihilation. They proved that even in war, there was always a gap between what leaders said and what they were willing to do, and the right negotiator, moving silently through that gap, could alter the course of history without anyone ever knowing they were there. There's a certain audacity to pretending you don't care when everything hangs in the balance. The false retreat wasn't just a negotiation tactic, it was high-stakes theater, a carefully choreographed performance where the act of walking away could be more powerful than any siege engine. Picture a diplomat gathering his scrolls with deliberate slowness, his expression a mask of weary resignation as he announced his departure. Inside, he's counting every heartbeat, waiting for the moment when panic would crack the defender's resolve. This wasn't surrender, it was a psychological gambit designed to make the enemy chase after terms they just refused. The effectiveness of this bluff hinged on one brutal truth: siege warfare was a waiting game, and time always favored the attackers. A negotiator's feigned departure forced defenders to confront their own fragility. No more promises, no more chances, just the grim certainty of starvation or slaughter. At the Siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, a Byzantine envoy staged an elaborate exit after the Crusader lords rejected his terms, even having his escort pack their camp visibly. Within hours, messengers galloped after him with fresh concessions. The defenders had realized too late that his retreat meant no more food shipments from imperial lands. But executing this tactic required razor-sharp timing. Pull the bluff too soon and the enemy might call it, leaving you with no leverage. Wait too long and they might already be too desperate to care. The masters of the false retreat understood the sweet spot, when defenders had just enough hope to fear losing it. During the War of the Roses, the Earl of Warwick famously broke a stalemate at the siege of Bamberg Castle by abruptly ending talks and marching his troops toward the horizon only to halt just out of sight. The garrison, imagining themselves abandoned to the king's wrath, sent riders begging to reopen negotiations before his army vanished entirely. What made the ruse so potent was its duality. For the besiegers, it was a zero-risk maneuver. They could always return tomorrow with the same demands, but for those inside the walls, the negotiators retreating back symbolized something far darker, the closing of their last door to survival. Some envoys amplified this fear with subtle touches, like forgetting a map showing reinforcements weeks away or letting a scribe slip and mention an impending assault. The goal was never to convince the enemy they'd lost interest, but to make them question whether they'd just squandered their only chance. The most brilliant false retreats played on cultural expectations. In Iberia, where chivalric codes demanded honorable conduct, Muslim and Christian negotiators alike would stage very public, very angry exits after insulting offers, knowing their opponents would feel compelled to make amends. In the Baltic, Teutonic knights exploited pagan tribes' reverence for guest right by pretending to violate it, storming out of feasts to provoke guilt-driven concessions. Each variation tailored the illusion to local norms, turning social customs into psychological traps. Yet the tactic's true artistry lay in its aftermath. A negotiator who returned after a fake retreat couldn't seem triumphant. That would reveal the ploy. Instead, they played the reluctant savior, sighing as they persuaded their commander to give the enemy one final chance. It was this final layer of theater, the performance of magnanimity, that often broke defenses more thoroughly than any battering ram. Because in the end, the false retreat didn't just win sieges. It made the defeated feel like they'd chosen mercy, not submission. And that was the cruelest trick of all. Amid the brutality of medieval warfare, the Humanitarian Plea stood apart, not as a show of weakness, but as a calculated appeal to whatever shred of mercy might linger in a conqueror's heart. Unlike threats or bribes, this tactic didn't target greed or fear. It aimed straight for the conscience. Picture a gaunt-faced envoy standing before a battle-hardened general, unfurling a scroll listing the hundreds of children who'd already starved inside the besieged city's walls. No demands, no bluster, just the quiet weight of shared humanity. In an era where chivalric ideals coexisted with ruthless pragmatism, this approach was a gamble. But when it worked, it could unravel months of resistance with a single moment of empathy. The effectiveness of the Humanitarian Plea hinged on two fragile assumptions: that the opposing commander had a conscience to sway, and that his soldiers could be shamed into restraint. During the Siege of Leningrad in the 14th century, defenders sent out a delegation of orphaned children, pale, hollow-eyed, to beg the attacking Teutonic knights for bread. The knights, sworn to protect the innocent, broke ranks to share their rations, forcing their commander to call off the assault or risk mutiny. Similarly, in the Iberian Peninsula, Muslim negotiators often parleyed during Ramadan, leveraging the holy month's emphasis on charity to secure ceasefires for famine-stricken towns. The genius lay in framing surrender not as defeat but as an act of collective compassion. Yet this tactic wasn't just about pity, it was theater. Negotiators amplified suffering for maximum effect. A chronicle from the 100 Years' War describes French envoys escorting English commanders on a tour of their own siege lines, pointing out the distended bellies of peasant children scavenging for scraps. The spectacle was staged, but the horror was real. Other envoys weaponized grief. During the Siege of Constantinople, a Byzantine diplomat reportedly collapsed sobbing mid-negotiation while recounting how mothers inside the walls were boiling leather for soup. The Ottoman vizier, moved, or perhaps unnerved by the display, agreed to spare the city's churches if they surrendered within 3 days. What made the Humanitarian Plea so unpredictable was its dependence on cultural context. In societies where rulers styled themselves as paternal figures, like the Confucian-inspired courts of East Asia, appeals to mercy carried weight. But in factions where ruthlessness was a badge of honor, such pleas could backfire spectacularly. When the Mongols besieged Nishapur in 1221, defenders sent out a delegation of veiled women and priests, hoping to trigger taboos against harming the vulnerable. The response, a volley of arrows followed by a messenger with a chilling reply. The Khan's mercy extends only to those who kneel before his shadow. The darkest truth about this tactic, its success often revealed more about the besiegers than the negotiators. When Richard the Lionheart spared the lives of Acre's women and children in 1191, it wasn't purely altruism, it bolstered his image as a chivalrous king. Conversely, when a plea failed, it exposed the hollowness of an enemy's virtues. The siege of Béziers during the Albigensian Crusade ended in massacre after defenders paraded starving civilians before the papal legate. His infamous response, "Kill them all, God will know his own," became a lesson in how easily ideals could crumble under ambition. Yet even in failure, the humanitarian plea left a mark. Chroniclers recorded these moments not just as military events, but as moral tests. A negotiator's appeal for mercy might not always open gates, but it could etch a commander's name into history as either a monster or a man of honor. And sometimes that was enough to make even the hardest conqueror pause, if only for a heartbeat before choosing the kind of legacy he wished to leave. Sometimes the best way to win a siege wasn't by flexing strength, but by carefully hiding it. The feigned weakness tactic was a delicate dance of deception, where diplomats deliberately exaggerated their own vulnerabilities to make the enemy overconfident. Imagine a negotiator arriving at the gates of a besieged city with slumped shoulders and a carefully rehearsed sigh, lamenting how his own troops were down to their last sacks of grain, how dysentery had ravaged the camp, how whispers of mutiny grew louder each night. Every word was calculated to plant a single, irresistible thought in the defenders' minds: we can outlast them. That false confidence was the trap. This strategy worked because it exploited one of the most predictable human instincts, the urge to press an advantage. During the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, Crusader envoys spun elaborate tales of their dwindling supplies and quarreling commanders, even staging fake fights between soldiers in view of the walls. The Muslim defenders, convinced relief was unnecessary, delayed calling for reinforcements. By the time they realized the ruse, Portuguese ships had already blockaded the harbor. Similarly, Byzantine chronicles describe an envoy who accidentally let a city's spies witness his army's desperate slaughter of their last horses for food, a spectacle that convinced the defenders to break their own rationing, exhausting their reserves weeks too soon. The brilliance of feigned weakness lay in its psychological precision. Too much despair might embolden the enemy to sally out for an easy victory, while too little would fail to lower their guard. The sweet spot, making the besiegers seem manageably weak, just unstable enough to make waiting them out feel safer than fighting. At the Siege of Harfleur, English negotiators spread rumors that Henry V's army was riddled with desertions, prompting the French to reject favorable surrender terms. What they didn't know, those deserters were actually scouts clearing the path for a surprise assault. Within days, the gates fell, but the tactic's real artistry was in its details. A negotiator might wear slightly dirtier robes than usual, or let his voice crack with exhaustion. Some staged intercepted letters detailing fictitious supply crises, others orchestrated panicked withdrawals of small troop contingents to sell the illusion. The Venetians were masters of this during their siege of Zara. They deliberately let their naval formation appear disorganized, luring the defenders into neglecting their seaward defenses. The moment their guard dropped, the full fleet struck. What made feigned weakness so devastating was its asymmetry. The besiegers could always reverse the narrative later, revealing their true strength at the decisive moment. But the defenders, once convinced of their advantage, often made irreversible mistakes, delaying harvests, splitting forces, or rejecting alliances they no longer believed they needed. By the time the truth became clear, the negotiators' original lies would have already done their work, and that was the cruelest twist of all. The moment the enemy believed they'd won was usually the moment they'd already lost. There's a moment in every siege when words alone aren't enough, when logic and self-interest hit a wall, and only something bolder can shatter the stalemate. That's when the greatest negotiators turn to the grand gesture, a calculated act of theater so audacious it could rewrite the rules of engagement in an instant. Picture a lone diplomat riding through the gates of a hostile city, his hands empty, his chest unprotected, his very presence screaming trust before he'd even spoken a word. This wasn't just bravery, it was psychological judo, using the enemy's expectations against them. History's most effective gestures played on a simple truth: people struggle to hate what they've begun to admire. During the Siege of Damietta in the 13th century, a crusader envoy named Jacques de Vitry didn't just request a meeting, he walked into the Muslim-held city wearing a hair shirt, publicly prostrating himself before the defenders' leaders. The act was so shockingly humble that it momentarily suspended the usual rules of war. Rumors spread that he'd been granted divine protection, and within days, negotiations that had been frozen for months began to thaw. The brilliance lay in its simplicity. By making himself vulnerable, he'd given the defenders permission to lower their guard without losing face. But the grand gesture wasn't just about humility, sometimes it was about spectacle. When the Mongol general Subutai besieged Kiev, he could have relied on his reputation for brutality. Instead, he staged a demonstration outside the walls, personally wrestling one of his own champion warriors to the ground, then sparing him with a laugh. The message was unmistakable. Even his own men weren't safe from his strength, yet mercy was possible. The Kivans, expecting a demand for surrender, found themselves negotiating with a man who'd just proven he didn't need their submission to prove his power. It was this duality, the blend of might and magnanimity, that made the tactic so potent. The risk, of course, was monumental. For every envoy who earned respect through daring, another became a cautionary tale. A Burgundian negotiator who entered a rebellious Flemish city with a noose around his neck, symbolically offering his life if terms were broken, found the gesture backfire when the rebels cheerfully accepted the implied threat. Yet even failures revealed the gesture's power. The act was so memorable that chroniclers recorded it centuries later, proof of how deeply such symbolism could etch itself into the collective mind. What separated the masterful from the merely theatrical was authenticity. A grand gesture couldn't feel like a trick. It had to resonate as a genuine reflection of the negotiator's character. When the Black Prince allowed the captured French king Joan II to roam freely during the 100 Years' War, hosting him at feasts and even jousting with him, it wasn't just chivalry, it was a living argument that honorable treatment awaited those who yielded. The French nobility, raised on tales of Arthurian honor, found themselves disarmed not by force, but by the uncomfortable realization that their enemy might be more knightly than they were. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the grand gesture is how it transcended culture. In Japan, samurai negotiators would sometimes exchange prized swords mid-parley, a ritual so sacred that breaking terms after it became unthinkable. In the Islamic world, envoys recited poetry from memory to prove their education and worthiness to negotiate. Each society had its own language of symbols, but the underlying principle remained. Sometimes, the quickest way to a person's mind is through their sense of wonder. And in the high-stakes game of siege negotiation, wonder could be the rarest and most powerful weapon of all. The most fragile part of any besieged city wasn't its walls, it was the delicate web of alliances holding its people together. A shrewd negotiator could unravel that web with nothing more than a whisper in the right ear. While armies clashed outside, these diplomats waged a quieter war inside, turning neighbor against neighbor and ambition against loyalty. The key lay in understanding that no city was truly united. Behind every gate stood factions with competing desires, merchants craving open trade routes, nobles jealous of rivals, soldiers weary of unpaid wages, peasants pushed to the brink by hunger. The moment a negotiator found that fracture line, the real siege began. Take the fall of Constantinople in 1453. While Ottoman cannons battered the walls, Mehmed II's envoys were busy exploiting centuries-old tensions between the city's Italian and Greek populations. They promised Genoa's merchants special trading privileges if they stood aside, and suddenly, whole sections of the defense found their supply lines mysteriously delayed. Similar divisions doomed the French at Rouen in 1419, where English negotiators secretly promised the city's guilds lower taxes under their rule. By the time the French commander realized his own citizens were sabotaging the defense, it was too late. But the true masters of this tactic didn't just exploit existing rifts, they manufactured new ones. During the Siege of Granada, Castilian diplomats spread rumors that the Muslim ruler planned to abandon his people and flee to North Africa. The lie, repeated in market squares and mosques, eroded trust so thoroughly that defenders began deserting their posts. Other negotiators staged elaborate charades. One Burgundian envoy pretended to be overheard gossiping about a noble family's plot to overthrow their own king, knowing servants would carry the tale straight to the palace. Within days, paranoia ripped through the leadership like wildfire. The risk, of course, was backlash. A clumsy attempt to bribe the wrong official could harden resistance, as the Mongols learned at the Siege of Kiev, when their gold offer to a Slavic prince was publicly thrown from the walls, uniting the city in defiance. The smartest negotiators played a subtler game. They'd identify the most respected figure in a faction, a guild master, a popular priest, and shower them with small, deniable favors, extra rations for their followers, a private guarantee of safety. By the time the larger bribe was proposed, the groundwork of trust was already laid. What made this tactic so devastating was its invisibility. Unlike battering rams or starvation, the erosion of unity left no visible scars until the moment the gates swung open from within. And in that final hour, when the negotiator walked through those gates to accept surrender, the real victory wasn't over the enemy. It was over the very idea that solidarity could outlast human nature. The greatest sieges weren't won by breaking walls, but by proving no wall was ever strong enough to contain the fractures inside. Nothing shattered morale faster than the whispered rumor of an unstoppable army thundering toward the horizon. The bluff of reinforcements was siege negotiations' greatest psychological sleight of hand, a lie so terrifying it didn't need to be true, only plausible. Imagine a dust-choked envoy striding into a defiant city's war council, casually mentioning the 50,000 fresh troops his king had summoned from the frontier. No proof offered, no details given, just the seed of doubt planted with surgical precision. The brilliance lay in exploiting a universal truth. In the fog of siege warfare, the unknown was always more frightening than the visible threat. History's most effective bluffs leveraged geography and timing. A negotiator facing a coastal fortress might spin tales of ships spotted just beyond the horizon, knowing the defenders couldn't scout past the blockade. At the Siege of Orleans in 1429, English commanders claimed Burgundian knights would arrive within days, a fiction that collapsed only when Joan of Arc's forces exposed their empty supply lines. Similarly, Ottoman envoys besieging Belgrade in 1456 invented an entire second army marching from the Danube, complete with forged letters intercepted from couriers. The trick, they timed the lie to coincide with real storms that grounded Hungarian reconnaissance flights, leaving the defenders no way to confirm the threat. But the masters of this ruse understood a crucial nuance. Specificity sold the story. Vague claims of reinforcements coming might raise eyebrows, but naming actual commanders, especially those with fearsome reputations, could trigger panic. During the Wars of the Roses, Yorkist negotiators whispered that the Butcher of Toten was en route with his infamous longbowmen. The mere invocation of that name sent Lancastrian garrisons scrambling for terms before the fictional army could materialize. Others borrowed credibility from real events. A Venetian agent once let slip that mercenaries hired for another war had been diverted mid-journey, weaving truth into fiction so seamlessly that spies couldn't untangle the deception. The risk, of course, was credibility. A bluff too grandiose claiming the Mongols would cross continents or that winter-bound mountain passes were suddenly clear could unravel into laughter. The smartest negotiators salted their lies with inconvenient truths. A Byzantine chronicle describes an envoy who admitted his own forces were low on supplies, making the lie of imminent relief seem like a desperate confession rather than a threat. Another tactic involved staged miscommunications, like the French captain who deliberately let defenders overhear him berating a messenger for arriving too early with news of the reinforcements 3 days out. The feigned anger made the fiction stick. What made this tactic so devastating was its asymmetry. The besiegers lost nothing if the bluff failed, while the defenders risked everything if they guessed wrong. And in the tense silence of a besieged city, where every hour stretched like a lifetime, imagination often did the negotiator's work for him. Rumors mutated, shadows became soldiers, and the distant howl of a wolf might be mistaken for war horns. By the time the truth became clear, the real damage was already done, not to the walls but to the will of those defending them, because in siege warfare, the most powerful army was sometimes the one that existed only in the enemy's mind. The promise of safe passage wasn't just mercy, it was a psychological masterstroke. In the smoke-choked chaos of a besieged city, where defenders faced the grim specter of slaughter, the simple guarantee of walking away alive could unravel months of resistance faster than any battering ram. But this tactic wasn't about kindness, it was about calculus. A negotiator offering safe passage wasn't just saving lives, he was removing the one obstacle that turned desperate men into fanatics, the certainty of death. Consider the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusader forces, bloodied from months of fighting, knew the Fatimid defenders would fight to the last breath if they believed surrender meant massacre. So their envoys crafted an offer so precise it cut through the despair. Any soldier who laid down arms could leave unharmed, with enough supplies to reach Muslim-held Ascalon. The key, they had the Egyptian governor's own brother, a captured emir, publicly endorse the terms. With that single gesture, the defenders' resolve fractured. Why die for a lost cause when survival was possible? Yet the true art lay in making these promises credible. In an era where truces were routinely broken, negotiators had to engineer trust from thin air. Some invoked divine witnesses, like the Templar envoy who swore terms on a fragment of the true cross during the Siege of Acre. Others leveraged third parties. Italian bankers often acted as guarantors, since harming surrendered foes would mean forfeiting their lucrative trade loan. The smartest negotiators understood that reputation was currency. When Saladin spared the defenders of Karak in 1188 despite their earlier betrayals, his mercy wasn't altruism, it was advertising. Future cities would surrender faster knowing his word was iron, but the tactic's brilliance hid razor-sharp edges, offer safe passage too early, and defenders might interpret it as weakness, emboldening them to hold out for better terms. Wait too long and rage might eclipse reason, as happened at the Siege of Béziers, where defenders, pushed past starvation, chose martyrdom over compromise. The masters of this game timed their offers to the hour, usually just after a failed assault, when the taste of near death still lingered on the defenders' tongues. What made safe passage so revolutionary was its ripple effect. A single honorable surrender could reshape entire campaigns. After the Mongol general Subutai spared the artisans of Nishapur in 1221, escorting them personally to safety, word spread like wildfire. Dozens of Persian cities opened their gates rather than risk annihilation, trading resistance for survival. That was the negotiators' hidden power, not just to end sieges, but to rewrite the rules of war itself, one spared life at a time. A hostage wasn't just a prisoner, it was a living, breathing contract, a human promise etched in flesh and blood. In an era without international courts or binding treaties, the exchange of high-ranking captives became the closest thing medieval negotiators had to a guarantee. Picture a tense parley outside a besieged castle, where the real bargaining wasn't over land or gold, but over which noble son would be sent to live in the enemy's court as insurance. This was diplomacy stripped to its rawest form, trust but verify with lives on the line. The calculus of hostage-taking was deceptively simple in theory, brutally complex in practice. A king might demand the enemy commander's firstborn as collateral, but that same hostage could become a liability if mistreated. The chronicles of the 100 Years' War tell of an English duke who hosted his French counterpart's teenage heir not in a dungeon, but as an honored guest, hunting together, dining at the same table. The message was clear: break the treaty and this privileged life vanishes. The French held up their end of the bargain, but the real artistry lay in selecting the right hostages. A lesser knight might be worthless as leverage, while a beloved royal sibling could backfire if their suffering turned public opinion. During the Siege of Antioch, Crusader negotiators deliberately requested the Muslim governor's elderly mother, knowing her advanced age made her a symbol of vulnerability rather than threat. When the governor saw her escorted safely through enemy lines unharmed, even respectfully cloaked against the cold, his resistance crumbled. Contrast that with the disastrous Venetian demand for the Byzantine emperor's youngest son during a naval standoff. The boy's subsequent death in custody from natural causes fueled generations of hatred. Hostage exchanges also revealed the delicate dance of cultural expectations. In Mongol society, where hostages often lived as adoptive family members, a well-treated captive might later advocate for their captors. Japanese samurai considered it an honor to serve as hostages, their loyalty transferring seamlessly to new lords. But in feudal Europe, where personal honor ran deep, a hostage's escape or suicide could shatter carefully built trust overnight. The infamous case of Duke Leopold of Austria, who leapt from a tower rather than remain a bargaining chip, taught negotiators a grim lesson. Some men prized honor above survival. Perhaps the most ingenious twist was the hostage as spy. Savvy negotiators knew a captive's eyes and ears were still open. When the Sultan Saladin took Richard the Lionheart's nephew as collateral during the Third Crusade, he didn't just secure terms, he gained an unwitting source on European court politics. Other hostages turned the tables, like the Castilian prince who memorized every detail of his Moorish captor's fortifications during his imprisonment, later using the knowledge to conquer their strongest castle. Yet for all its ruthlessness, the hostage system had an unexpected byproduct. It humanized the enemy, sharing meals, learning languages, Even forming friendships across battle lines created reluctant empathy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts how a Norman knight, after years guarding his Saxon hostage, intervened to stop the man's execution, for he had grown dear to me as a brother, though our peoples bled. In the end, that was the paradox of medieval hostage diplomacy. The same practice that began as cold-blooded insurance sometimes became the thin thread that kept civilizations from unraveling entirely. Patience wasn't just a virtue in siege negotiation, it was a weapon, sharpened over months and sometimes years of calculated stillness. While flashy tactics like bluffs or grand gestures could crack a city's resolve overnight, the long game played out in slow motion, a war of inches where the real battle wasn't for walls but for the minds behind them. Picture a negotiator returning season after season, his offers subtly shifting as hunger and fatigue gnawed at the defender's will. No dramatic ultimatums, no theatrical walks, just the relentless, grinding certainty that time was on his side. This was diplomacy as a siege engine where the passage of days did more damage than any catapult. The long game thrived on a brutal truth. In warfare, morale was a finite resource. A city might rally in the first months of a siege, buoyed by patriotism or religious fervor. But as winters passed and children grew thin, even the staunchest defenders began weighing ideals against empty bellies. The Siege of Candia in the 17th century dragged on for a staggering 21 years, with Venetian and Ottoman negotiators locked in a dance of attrition. Each summer, the Ottomans would sweeten their terms slightly, offering better trade rights, lighter taxes, while Venetian envoys countered with delays, praying for relief fleets that rarely came. The real victory wasn't won in battle. It came when the defenders finally admitted their allies had forgotten them. Mastering this tactic required an almost inhuman detachment. Negotiators had to balance pressure with restraint, tightening the screws just enough to amplify despair without triggering a last, desperate stand. At the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent's diplomats perfected this rhythm. They allowed sporadic food shipments into the city early on, letting defenders taste hope before cutting supplies again. The goal, to make surrender feel inevitable rather than abrupt, a gradual wearing down of the spirit. By the time the Knights Hospitaller capitulated, their resistance had bled away like sand through an hourglass, yet the long game's greatest power lay in its invisibility. Unlike a battering ram or a blockade, its effects were felt in whispers, a mother's fading lullaby, a soldier's hollow cough, the way once proud banners hung limp in the dust. Chroniclers noted how besieged populations would cling to superstition as time wore on, interpreting bird flights or weather patterns as omens. Negotiators exploited this descent into fatalism, timing their offers to coincide with eclipses or comets, letting nature magnify their psychological warfare. The cruelest irony, those who wielded time as a weapon often became its prisoners. The same envoy who began a siege with fiery rhetoric might spend years watching children grow into soldiers on both sides of the walls. Records from the 100 Years' War describe French and English negotiators sharing wine during truces, their personal bonds deepening even as their kingdoms bled. In the end, the long game didn't just test strategy, it revealed the absurdity of war itself, where the only true victor was often the patient earth, waiting to reclaim whatever scraps of glory men left behind. History often paints medieval warfare as a world of armored men clashing on battlefields, but behind the scenes, some of the most skilled negotiators wore gowns, not chainmail. Women, particularly in noble and royal circles, wielded influence in siege diplomacy that defied the era's rigid gender norms. While chroniclers rarely spotlighted their contributions, records reveal queens, duchesses, and even abbesses stepping into the breach when male egos stalled negotiations. Their power didn't come from titles alone, it sprang from something far more potent: the ability to navigate social networks invisible to traditional envoys. Helena of Aquitaine stands as the most famous example, but her genius wasn't unique. During the Siege of Toulouse in 1251, Joan of Dampierre, a countess with familial ties to both the French crown and rebellious vassals, shuttled between camps for weeks. Her letters reveal a masterclass in indirect persuasion, hosting teas where offhand remarks planted seeds of compromise, or arranging chance encounters between rival knights during religious festivals. Unlike male negotiators bound by formal protocols, noble women could exploit the informal spaces of medieval society: childbirth chambers, embroidery circles, pilgrimage routes. These weren't just social gatherings, they were the back-channels of diplomacy. The Church also quietly leveraged women's influence. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen acted as trusted intermediaries, their convents becoming neutral ground for parleys. A 12th century manuscript from Clairvaux Abbey describes how the abbess of Fontevraud brokered a truce between Anjou and Brittany by framing concessions as acts of Christian charity rather than surrender. Cloistered women had unique advantages. Their vows ostensibly removed them from political ambition, making their counsel seem divinely inspired rather than self-serving. But the true stealth weapon of female negotiators was their mastery of symbolic gestures. Where men might exchange swords or sign parchments, noble women traded relics, gifted illuminated psalters with carefully chosen verses, or in one brilliant case orchestrated a marriage between rival families' children mid-siege. At the standoff over Château de Loudun in 1224, the Duchess of Burgundy didn't just deliver terms, she arrived with her young son and the enemy lord's daughter playing together in her carriage. The image of innocence amid war shattered the defenders' resolve faster than any battering ram. What made these women so effective wasn't just their methods, but the cultural blind spots they exploited. A baron might dismiss a queen's envoy as harmless until her gentle suggestions revealed an encyclopedic knowledge of his army's supply routes. A mercenary captain could ignore a nun's plea for mercy until she quoted his own mother's letters begging him to spare a convent. Their greatest power lay in being underestimated, then using that invisibility to rewrite the rules of the game. While kings claimed credit for peace treaties, the parchment often bore the fingerprints of the women who drafted them in candlelit chambers, far from the roar of the battlefield. A negotiator stepping onto foreign soil entered more than just a physical space. They crossed into an invisible web of rituals, taboos, and unspoken rules that could make or break their mission. Cultural leverage wasn't about memorizing customs. It was about demonstrating respect in ways the local population recognized instantly. Consider the Mongol envoys who, before speaking a word of terms, presented Tibetan monasteries with ceremonial white scarves, a gesture so precisely aligned with Buddhist tradition that it disarmed hostility before negotiations even began. This wasn't politeness, it was psychological judo, using cultural fluency to turn strangers into reluctant allies. The most effective diplomats treated local traditions as a linguistic code to be mastered. When Venetian agents negotiated with the Mamluks, they knew never to hand documents directly to the Sultan, a protocol reserved for his viziers lest they insult his divine status. In Scandinavia, envoys from the Holy Roman Empire adopted the Norse custom of gift-giving at Yuletide, embedding their political proposals within presents of Frankish glassware and fine textiles. These weren't bribes, but symbolic acts that whispered, "We see you," and in societies where honor dictated every interaction, being seen could mean the difference between a truce and a massacre. Some negotiators weaponized cultural knowledge with surgical precision. During the Reconquista, Castilian diplomats facing Muslim defenders would deliberately schedule parleys on Fridays, when the call to prayer reminded all present of Islam's emphasis on mercy. Others exploited seasonal traditions like the Byzantine envoy who arrived during the Slavic festival of Cupola Night, framing his peace offer as a gift to coincide with the holiday's exchange rituals. The brilliance lay in making surrender feel less like defeat and more like participation in an ancient rhythm, but missteps carried devastating consequences. When Crusader envoys at Acre unknowingly trampled a Quran during heated talks, they ignited a riot that collapsed months of progress. Contrast that with Saladin's negotiators at Kerak, who not only avoided pork products near their Christian counterparts but served dishes honoring the Virgin Mary, a nod to shared veneration that built unexpected bridges. The lesson was clear. In siege diplomacy, the smallest cultural detail could become the fulcrum on which entire cities tipped. The true masters of this craft didn't just adapt to customs, they anticipated how traditions could mask strategic moves. A Mughal chronicle describes a Rajput fortress surrendering after the besieging emperor celebrated Diwali with them, lighting lamps along the siege lines to honor their faith. Only later did defenders realize the festive fires had illuminated secret weak points in their walls for the coming assault. Cultural leverage at its core was about speaking the enemy's language so fluently that they never noticed when you began rewriting the script. In the shadow of towering siege engines and starving garrisons, some of the most effective negotiations didn't hinge on honor or fear. They came down to cold, hard arithmetic. Wealthy medieval cities faced a brutal equation: the staggering cost of destruction versus the pragmatic price of surrender. Negotiators who mastered the economic argument spoke a language every merchant and monarch understood: the language of profit and loss. They didn't just present terms, they drafted mental balance sheets, proving that an open gate could be wiser than a broken one. Take the Siege of Bruges in 1302, where French envoys confronted a defiant city flush with textile wealth. Instead of threatening massacre, they commissioned detailed estimates. Scribes calculated the cost of rebuilding shattered wool markets, the years of lost trade, the interest on loans needed to feed displaced families. Then came the counteroffer, a modest tribute and trade concessions that would let commerce flow within weeks. The numbers were undeniable. Bruges leaders, raised in counting houses, surrendered not out of weakness but because the math favored survival. This tactic thrived in cities where gold flowed thicker than blood. Venetian diplomats besieging Constantinople in 1204 didn't bother with chivalric posturing. They itemized the annual revenue from the Black Sea trade routes, proving the city was worth more intact than plundered. Similarly, during the Hanseatic League's conflicts, negotiators would arrive with ledgers listing the value of each warehouse, shipyard, and guild hall. The implicit threat wasn't violence, it was bankruptcy, but the economic argument's brilliance lay in its flexibility. For rulers, it offered face-saving pragmatism. Surrender became fiscal responsibility rather than cowardice. In Granada's final days, Castilian envoys let the emir's accountants verify their claims about war reparations, knowing the numbers would sway him more than any oath. For merchants, it transformed resistance from patriotism to bad business. Why die for a prince when your competitors would be trading again by spring? The darkest iterations targeted human nature itself. During the Siege of Ghent in 1488, Habsburg negotiators distributed lists showing how much defending nobles had already spent on mercenaries, and how much more they'd lose if the walls fell. Personal greed did what threats couldn't, yet the approach could backfire spectacularly if misapplied. When English envoys tried economic logic on the Scots at Berwick in 1318, defenders famously burned their own warehouses rather than let profit dictate pride. What made this tactic endure was its timelessness. The same principles that convinced medieval burghers to yield still echo in modern corporate takeovers and diplomatic sanctions. Because when stripped of banners and battle cries, every siege was ultimately about value, not just of land or lives, but of the future itself. And the negotiators who understood that didn't just end wars. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon was an abacus. Fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a ledger, its pages filled with the names of cities that had gambled and lost. The smartest negotiators understood that the most persuasive threats weren't the ones they made, but the ones defenders whispered to themselves in the dead of night. A diplomat didn't need to describe the horrors awaiting a defiant city. He simply had to remind its leaders of the smoldering ruins of the last place that had dared to test his king's patience. This was the legacy of fear, a psychological weapon forged not in the present, but in the ashes of the past. Consider the shadow that hung over every Italian city-state after the sack of Milan in 1162. When Frederick Barbarossa's envoys arrived at the gates of Cremona, they didn't bother listing their army's size or siege engines. Instead, they invited the ruling council to send observers to Milan's ruins, a 3-day ride away to verify the terms of surrender were still negotiable. The unspoken message was unmistakable. You've seen what happens to those who refuse. Now choose. Cremona opened its gates within the week. The power of historical precedent lay in its irrefutability. A negotiator's threat might be bluster, but the fate of Antioch in 1098 or Limoges in 1370 was etched in blood and chronicles. During the Hussite Wars, imperial diplomats circulated illustrated pamphlets showing the massacre at Kut Nahora not to shock, but to reassure. See how swiftly it ended for them. The captions implied, "Your suffering need not last so long." The genius was in framing annihilation as a choice rather than a certainty, making surrender feel like the rational alternative to a foregone conclusion. Some envoys elevated this tactic to performance art. At the Siege of Carcassonne, Albigensian crusaders paraded captured knights from fallen Beziers in chains past the walls, their branded cheeks proof of the mercy shown to survivors. Others weaponized rumor networks. Mongol negotiators made sure tales of Nishapur's obliteration in 1221 reached the next city before their army did. By the time their envoys arrived, defenders were already measuring their walls against the memory of a river turned red with blood. But the true masters of this grim calculus knew fear worked best when layered with hope. A negotiator from Castile confronting a Muslim fortress wouldn't just evoke the fall of Cordoba. He'd contrast it with the prosperous coexistence in Toledo, where surrender had spared both lives and livelihoods. The message became a brutal equation. Here's what you lose, here's what you keep. The arithmetic is yours to solve. This duality, the carrot of survival paired with the stick of historical precedent, made resistance feel less like bravery and more like ignoring a weather vane before a storm. What made the legacy of fear so devastating was its universality. Whether facing Norse warlords or Ottoman pashas, every culture had its own book of consequences, its pages filled with cautionary tales passed down through generations. The negotiator's role wasn't to write new chapters, but to flip to the most relevant passage and let the defenders read their own fate between the lines. And in that moment, when memory became prophecy, even the stoutest gates could swing open without a single stone being loosed from a catapult. Mercenaries changed the calculus of siege warfare in ways kings and commanders often refused to admit. While loyal knights might fight to the death for honor or homeland, A hired sword's allegiance could pivot on a single coin. Savvy negotiators didn't just see these sellswords as enemies, they recognized them as potential pressure points, men who could be flipped with the right combination of gold and pragmatism. The moment a mercenary captain glanced at his thinning ranks and unpaid contracts, the real battle wasn't outside the walls but inside his ledger. History brims with sieges decided by whispered deals in mercenary camps. At the Siege of Naples in 1495, French diplomats didn't waste breath appealing to the city's Neapolitan defenders. Instead, they targeted the Swiss pikemen guarding the gates, offering back pay with interest if they stepped aside by dawn. The gamble paid off. By sunrise, the mercenaries had vanished, leaving the citadel undefended. Similarly, during the War of the Eight Saints, Florentine envoys exploited rivalries between competing condottieri companies, playing one group against another until the entire defense collapsed like a house of cards. But the genius of mercenary negotiations lay in their layered incentives. A smart diplomat didn't just offer money, he offered certainty. To men who lived contract to contract, the promise of steady employment under a new master often outweighed fleeting loyalty. The Venetian archives detail how their agents would slip into enemy camps with signed commissions already prepared, complete with bonuses for early acceptance. Other negotiators dangled pardons for past offenses, like the English envoy who convinced Welsh mercenaries to abandon their French employers by wiping clean their criminal records, a clean slate proving more valuable than any purse. The darkest negotiations exploited mercenary culture itself. Many companies operated like medieval unions with strict rules about hazard pay and retreat clauses. A chronicle from the Hussite Wars describes how imperial diplomats pored over a captured mercenary contract, spotting a loophole. The fighters were only obligated to defend walls, not underground tunnels. That night, sappers dug unchallenged beneath the fortifications while the hired guards above technically kept their word. Other envoys weaponized homesickness, like the Castilian agent who spread rumors among German landsknechts that their homeland was being raided in their absence, sparking mass desertions. Yet mercenaries weren't just passive tools, they played both sides with chilling professionalism. The infamous White Company under Sir John Hawkwood once staged a sham retreat during the Siege of Milan, only to return weeks later under a new contract with the very city they'd been hired to attack. Such betrayals forced negotiators to think like the mercenaries they sought to sway, calculating risk, measuring morale, and always reading the fine print. Because in the end, the most dangerous weapon in a siege wasn't a trebuchet or a battering ram, but a hired soldier with a price tag and a pulse. A storm cloud rolling in at the perfect moment could be worth 1,000 soldiers to a medieval negotiator. In an age where the natural world was seen as a canvas of divine messages, symbols weren't just props, they were psychological artillery. Picture an envoy standing in the no-man's land between armies, clutching a relic swaddled in silk, his voice rising over the wind as he declares the approaching tempest a sign of God's displeasure. The real power wasn't in the object itself, but in the shudder of recognition it sent through defenders already straining to interpret every omen. Take the Siege of Antioch in 1098, where Crusader negotiators timed their final ultimatum to coincide with a solar eclipse. As shadows swallowed the battlefield, they unfurled a banner said to be woven from the Virgin Mary's cloak, proclaiming the darkness a warning to the city's defenders. The effect was instantaneous. Superstitious garrison troops, already rattled by months of starvation, began deserting their posts within hours. Similarly, Ottoman envoys besieging Belgrade in 1456 staged a midnight procession with captured Christian icons, their torches flickering in deliberate mimicry of the city's own religious festivals. The psychological blow was devastating. If the invaders could wield their sacred symbols so casually, what protection did the walls still offer? Relics became particularly potent bargaining chips. A chronicle from the Reconquista describes how Castilian diplomats would arrive at Muslim-held fortresses bearing fragments of the true cross, not just as proof of divine favor, but as subtle reminders of Christianity's growing political dominance. The implicit threat, resistance, wasn't just defiance of the king, but of heaven itself. Other negotiators weaponized local folklore. During the Baltic Crusades, Teutonic knights displayed the captured standards of pagan tribes while deliberately misinterpreting bird migrations as omens of their impending victory. The goal was never to convince the learned, but to erode the morale of the masses whose labor kept the siege defenses running. Whether manipulation or the illusion of it reached its zenith during the Siege of Rhodes in 1522. Suleiman the Magnificent's envoys, aware of the defenders' reliance on seasonal winds for resupply, spread rumors that Ottoman astrologers had bound the breezes through dark arts. When an unseasonal calm indeed paralyzed Christian ships, panic spread like wildfire through the starving garrison. The truth, pure coincidence leveraged into psychological warfare. Even mundane objects could be transformed. At the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc's negotiators waved simple white banners embroidered with lilies, turning a heraldic motif into a rallying cry that outshone any battle standard. The darkest genius of symbolic negotiation lay in its deniability. Unlike direct threats that could unite defenders, an omen allowed individuals to rationalize surrender without shame. When Byzantine envoys scattered ancient coins outside Thessalonica's walls, coins bearing the face of Constantine, the city's founder, they didn't need to spell out the message. Defenders whispering in the markets could convince themselves they weren't yielding to men, but to the inexorable tide of history. That was the negotiator's final trick, letting symbols speak so loudly that when the gates finally creaked open, no one could quite remember who'd first suggested it. Failure wasn't just a setback in siege negotiation. It was a pivot point where diplomacy gave way to a grim new calculus. When talks collapsed, the negotiator's role shifted from persuader to architect of consequences, tasked with ensuring their threats retained teeth without turning their own side into monsters. This was the tightrope walk of credibility, how to make devastation feel inevitable yet not indiscriminate. A commander who raised every rebellious city would soon find none willing to surrender, while one who blinked too often invited endless defiance. The aftermath of failed negotiations wasn't chaos. It was a meticulously staged lesson in cause and effect. Consider the Siege of Limoges in 1370, where the Black Prince's envoys had offered generous terms, only for the city to abruptly break its oath and rebel again. What followed wasn't mindless slaughter, but a calibrated display of force. The prince ordered the execution of 3 knights who'd broken their parole, a targeted act meant to underscore the cost of betrayal, while sparing the bulk of the population. Chroniclers noted the precision. The gallows were erected where the original treaty had been signed, a brutal reminder that words once given carried weight. The message reverberated across Aquitaine, not because of the body count, but because the punishment fit the crime with chilling exactness. The smartest commanders understood that aftermaths were performances for future audiences. After the Mongols annihilated Nishapur in 1221 for killing their envoys, their next target, the city of Herat, received a stark choice: send us the heads of those who harmed our diplomats or share their fate. Herat complied within hours. The lesson: violence wasn't the goal. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one wanted repeated. Even the infamous no-quarter sieges of the 30 Years' War followed an unspoken script. Garrisons that surrendered before the first cannon shot were often spared, while those who resisted past a certain point became examples. Yet restraint could be as powerful as ruthlessness. When Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, his terms mirrored those the Crusaders had denied Muslims a century earlier, but with a twist. Instead of mass executions, he allowed wealthy citizens to buy their freedom while releasing the poor for free. The contrast wasn't just magnanimity, it was a masterclass in comparative reputation building. Future defenders would remember, surrender to this man meant survival, while resistance meant facing men with no such scruples. The true test of a negotiator's skill came in these moments of transition, when the velvet glove came off, but the iron fist still had to choose its targets wisely. A chronicle from the War of the Roses describes how Edward IV's envoys, after a failed parley at Bamberg Castle, deliberately delayed the assault by 3 days. Not from mercy but strategy, they wanted defenders to see sappers digging tunnels, trebuchets being assembled, and crucially, to notice the nooses being tied on nearby gallows. By the time the attack began, half the garrison had fled under cover of night. The siege ended without a major assault because the aftermath of failure had been made visible before the final blow fell. What separated the strategic from the sadistic was this ability to let consequences speak for themselves. The burning of a single granary might do more than a massacre if it convinced a city it couldn't outlast hunger. The exile of a rebel leader's family could undermine morale more effectively than slaughtering peasants. And sometimes, the most potent aftermath was simply walking away, letting a defiant city watch as the army marched toward softer targets, leaving them isolated and irrelevant. Because in the end, the purpose of failure's consequences wasn't just punishment, it was making sure the next negotiation began with everyone remembering how the last one ended. Medieval siege negotiations operated by an invisible playbook, rules so deeply ingrained that breaking them could poison a ruler's reputation for generations. These weren't just customs, they were the fragile threads holding together the fabric of wartime diplomacy. Take the sacred protection granted to envoys. Harming a negotiator was tantamount to declaring open season on all future diplomacy. When King John of England once imprisoned a French diplomat in the early 13th century, the backlash was so severe that his own nobles pressured him to release the man with public apologies. The message was clear: some lines, once crossed, turned allies into skeptics and neutrals into enemies. Yet the true test of a negotiator's skill lay in navigating the gray areas of these unwritten codes. Churches and holy sites, for example, were technically immune from looting, but accidental fires during battles somehow kept happening. The difference between a leader remembered as pragmatic versus sacrilegious often hinged on theatrical gestures. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, Crusader commanders made a show of donating stolen altar gold back to local monasteries. The act was less about piety and more about maintaining the illusion of respect, ensuring future cities would still trust their promises. The most cunning diplomats turned these unspoken rules into weapons. During the Siege of Carcassonne, Simon de Montfort's negotiators deliberately fed defenders' children through the gates during a truce, not out of mercy, but to frame themselves as honorable while the city's supplies dwindled faster. Conversely, violating norms could be a calculated risk. Edward I of England famously executed Scottish envoys during the Siege of Berwick in 1296, gambling that fear of his ruthlessness would make other towns surrender faster. It worked, but at the cost of cementing his image as a brute, a reputation that fueled rebellions for decades. What made these rules so powerful was their reciprocity. A commander who spared a monastery today might find its monks vouching for his mercy tomorrow. When Saladin allowed Christian priests to keep their churches after taking Jerusalem, he wasn't just being generous, he was ensuring future Crusader-held cities would negotiate rather than fight to the death. The lesson echoed across centuries. In siege diplomacy, today's restraint could be tomorrow's leverage, but the unwritten code's greatest irony, its flexibility. The same society that gasped at harming envoys would cheer when a treacherous garrison was thrown from the walls. What mattered wasn't the act itself, but the story wrapped around it. A negotiator's true artistry lay in knowing when to break a rule and call it justice, or uphold it and call it grace, because in the end, these silent laws weren't about morality. They were about making sure that when the dust settled, there'd still be someone left to talk to. The strategies honed in the smoke-filled tents of medieval siege camps never truly faded. They simply evolved, slipping into modern conflict resolution like a second language we all speak without realizing it. Consider today's hostage negotiators talking down a barricaded suspect. The same principles of empathy, time manipulation, and incremental concessions apply. When a crisis negotiator mirrors a gunman's posture or offers a face-saving exit, they're channeling the same tactics a Byzantine envoy used to calm a rebellious duke 8 centuries ago. The tools have changed: megaphones instead of heralds, psych profiles instead of court gossip, but the core truth remains. Understanding someone's fears and desires is the skeleton key to diffusing conflict. Corporate boardrooms reveal even clearer parallels. The false retreat tactic, where medieval negotiators pretended to walk away to trigger panic, resurfaces in modern sales tactics like limited time offers or artificial scarcity. Tech acquisitions often follow the same script as feudal surrender terms. Lucrative golden parachutes for executives echoing the land grants and titles once dangled before defiant nobles. Even the mercenary mindset persists. Today's corporate raiders and private equity firms play the role of condottieri, switching allegiances based on quarterly returns rather than seasonal campaigns. Political summits might be the most direct descendants of medieval parleys. The choreography of a G20 meeting, neutral venues, carefully staged handshakes, bacchanal whispers mirrors the theatrics of the Congress of Arras in 1435, where Burgundian and French envoys negotiated under the guise of religious reconciliation. Modern diplomats still exploit cultural leverage, like when U.S. negotiators studying Confucian principles tailored their approach to Chinese counterparts, or when Middle Eastern peace talks schedule breaks around prayer times. The unspoken rules, too, remain intact. Violating diplomatic immunity today carries the same stigma as harming a medieval herald under truce flags. What's most fascinating is how these ancient tactics adapt to new transparency. Where medieval envoys relied on controlled leaks, accidentally dropping letters or staging public spectacles, modern politicians use social media and selective journalism to shape narratives. A tweeted hint about imminent deals serves the same purpose as a Mongol negotiator spreading rumors of approaching reinforcements. Both manipulate perception to force concessions. Yet some things resist change. Just as Venetian agents once bribed scribes to alter chronicles in their favor, today's spin doctors and lobbyists work to rewrite narratives in real time. The legacy of these medieval strategies endures because they tap into universal human psychology, our fear of loss, our craving for dignity, our susceptibility to stories. When a police negotiator buys time by debating trivial details, they're replaying the siege of Neuse. When a startup founder feigns disinterest during acquisition talks, they're channeling the false retreats of Burgundian diplomats. The castles may be glass towers now, and the swords replaced by contracts, but the game hasn't changed. Only the players have. The art of siege negotiation was a dance of wit, courage, and cunning, one that saved countless lives and shaped the course of history. These medieval diplomats were the unsung heroes of warfare, proving that words could be as mighty as swords. Behind every successful negotiation lay a delicate balance of psychology, timing, and cultural insight, tools as sharp as any blade. Think of the Venetian envoy who diffused a rebellion by quoting a rival city's poetry, or the Mongol diplomat who ended a standoff by sharing a meal with his captors. Their victories weren't measured in territory taken, but in bloodshed avoided, in cities preserved rather than reduced to ash. What's remarkable is how little these strategies have truly changed. Modern hostage negotiators still use the same principles of building rapport and finding common ground. International diplomats still exploit divisions within enemy ranks, just as their medieval counterparts turned merchants against nobles or soldiers against commanders. Even in business deals and everyday conflicts, we unconsciously echo these ancient tactics, offering face-saving compromises, leveraging deadlines as pressure, or staging strategic retreats to regain advantage. The battlefield has shifted from castle walls to boardrooms and social media, but the human elements of fear, pride, and self-interest remain unchanged. Yet there's a deeper lesson here beyond mere technique. These negotiators remind us that conflict is rarely as simple as us versus them. The Siege of Lisbon ended because crusaders respected Muslim defenders enough to offer honorable terms. The fall of Constantinople began to unravel when Genoese traders put profit above patriotism. Time and again, the negotiators who succeeded were those who saw their opponents not as faceless enemies, but as people with hopes, fears, and price points. That recognition that even in war, there's room for shared humanity might be their most enduring legacy. As we close this chapter, consider how these ancient arts live on around you. The next time you witness a tense negotiation, whether in politics, at work, or even in your own family, look for the echoes of medieval diplomacy, that co-worker appealing to your sense of fairness. Straight from a Byzantine envoy's playbook, the politician offering concessions wrapped in patriotic symbolism, a page from Saladin's manual. History's greatest negotiators knew one truth we often forget. Persuasion isn't about overpowering someone's will, but helping them find a path they can accept. And that's a skill as valuable today as it was 1,000 years ago. If this journey into the past has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What negotiation tactics have you noticed in your own life? Until next time, remember, the sharpest weapon isn't always steel. Sometimes it's the right words spoken at the right moment. After all, the walls that seem unbreakable today might just need the right key to open them